We have John Bisu from Seasons with a talk titled Why Seasons Uses Gnosis Safe.
Oh. Cool. Testing. All right. GM. So I'm John. I'm one of the founders of Seasons, where we're trying to make collective ownership useful for everyone, starting with the first service of NFT fractionalization, which I'll dig deeper in as we proceed. And I'm sure you've heard a lot of definitions about, damn. Okay, so my objective today is to provide some light on why DAO tooling and infrastructure in general still remains very nascent, and why we chose Gnosis Safe to build on as a result. And I hope throughout this conversation it provides some interesting, even philosophical questions about DAOs for you to ponder, while also giving you some information about Seasons and what we do and why we chose Gnosis Safe. So you've heard a lot about DAO definitions throughout the conference. I'll give you another one. I think DAOs are just another type of organizations that have existed since the dawn of humanity. But the unique identifier is that now you can codify rules of participation with smart contracts. And that's unique because now you can have state changes on the organization based on code, so people have structural barriers on what they can or cannot do. And it seems like, for the most part, we've come to this idea that, for now, the most fairest means of participation is through a democratic token holder voting. And I'm going to pose a few scenarios to highlight why that's extremely primitive and why that requires us to work a lot more. So for scenario one, just to set the preface, assume that this DAO has communicated very clearly to its users that this proposals with a 51% vote gets passed, right? And then assume that all of this knowledge has been efficiently communicated. Everyone who joins the DAO is explicitly aware of this. So this is like blinding me, so I can't see the hands, but if the DAO has 100 million in its treasury, and somebody slowly obtains 51% and directs it all to himself through a governance proposal, even though 49 said no, how many of you think this is justified? Raise your hands. A few, okay. So how many of you think it's no, not justified? Okay, so more people saying no, right? So if you voted yes, you agree with this notion of a procedural justice, right? You have this idea that due to a fair notion of process, it doesn't really matter what the outcome is, right? For the people who voted no, it's based on this notion of like a substantive or distributive justice where, despite the process, you care more about kind of effectively what the outcome looks like. And I'll come back to maybe how Gnosis Safe and Seasons helps address this a little better. Next scenario, suppose Alice makes a proposal which gets rejected with a majority vote, and then should she be able to make the same proposal a week later? Who thinks yes? Okay. Who thinks no? Okay, I was wrong. I actually thought most people would say no. So I gotta change my script a little bit. Just kidding. Okay, so I personally think, at face value, it should be no. You can't just keep bombarding proposals until you think it can be passed. Something relatively similar happened with Tribe, where they first voted to make the users of the Fuse exploit whole. But then there was a second proposal that kind of said no, and then people started wondering, okay, well, can you start having proposals that just cancel out the first one because it didn't get executed in time? And all of these, I think, point to kind of how we as a community have built these DAO primitives with not enough thought of exactly how process around proposals and governance should be passed. Like, lawmaking for different governments for millennia has been iterated on, and different countries have different governance models, right? Like, the US has something called a bill before it is passed into a legislation, and it's exactly like a proposal. And if you read into like how laws are made, it's very similar to like what we're doing. Like, we're trying to reinvent the wheel in terms of like organizational governance, corporate governance, and it ties back to the opportunity of the definition of DAOs, where now you can have smart contracts that define what, let's say, an executive order might look like. Like in the US, the president can issue executive orders that are relatively arbitrary and wide in scope, and it becomes a point of legal discussion of whether a certain executive order is justified or not. You can make things simpler in terms of DAO organizations by obviously codifying it, and this is why we are building in this space. I'll explain what we do a little more, but in terms of some of the options that are available to build on DAOs today, there are a lot. I chose these as examples because I think it highlights some of, I guess, the more prominent movements. Like Aragon, I respect them a lot. They've been tackling the DAO problem since the very beginning. Even still, like last few months, they announced this attempt to create a new set of smart contracts, SDKs, that they think is more suitable for the DAO landscape today. Compound, as you know, has this amazing set of governance contracts that other people have forked. Nouns DAO is really prominent. They use a fork of Compound. And then OpenZeppelin also now released kind of like, not now, but been a while, but based off of Compound, where it's a little more modular, and they also allow for you to build your own governance contracts with interesting primitives where now you can specify certain types of voting power based on a combination of tokens or other contracts. But if you roll your own contracts, it's a lot of effort, right? Not everyone has the technical knowledge of being able to deploy a set of contracts for their DAO. That's just why you have some other DAO tooling services that allow you to spin up DAOs quickly. But again, kind of the parameters that you have are very primitive. So like an example is you have this notion of a voting delay, voting period, and a quorum, and that's usually kind of what exists across DAOs today. And then there's, Moloch DAO is, they popularized this notion of a rage quit, where anybody who doesn't agree with a proposal that's about to be passed can call this function and the exit pro rata based on their contributions. And I might go back to that. I'm realizing I'm talking a little too slowly. So where does Season come into play? Quickly, so we started with this platform called AxiTree, where back when Axie Infinity was on Ethereum, it was a platform to borrow and lend Axies. So back then, to actually get started with Axies, it was like $300 per Axies, and then people in the Philippines obviously could not afford them. So we built a service where they could borrow it for free, earn SLP, and then share the SLP with the renters. And then they moved away from Ethereum, so we're like, oh, fuck, what are we going to do? We're not going to go to Ronin. No shade, but we like Ethereum. And so we had this idea of moving from we had this idea for AxiTree where people would have Axies together, and then you would lend it out to people, let's say they're participating in tournaments. If they win in the tournament, the prize pool goes back into the owners and they distribute it, right? And the generalized model is collective ownership of NFTs. Now you have, we wanted to build a model where multiple people can own NFTs, and I think the 0 to 1 moment for Web3 in the context of owning assets is that now you can share ownership without a centralized party. You have different kind of platforms today that do something like, let's say, fractionalization of a car. They issue shares based on the value of a collector's car, but the maintenance and the management of that car is done by a trusted party, right? For digital assets, it's a little different. You can actually, through DAOs and smart contracts, make rules fair and codified. So for Seasons, what we do is we use the Gnosis safe. Very quickly, so our first service is NFT fractionalization. And the fractionalization as a concept is super clear, right? You take a very high-value NFT, break it into smaller tokens that represent the value of the NFT, and then the differentiator with us is that you are able to now govern the NFT. And the idea was that, take the Doge NFT that was fractionalized, which is the most popular form of fractionalization in NFTs today. The only thing that they have the ability to do is wait for a buyout, because the vault contract only takes that function in, right? So we wanted to kind of explore a model where ownership as a fractional owner was a little bit more meaningful. And our idea was that you put the NFTs into a Gnosis safe, and we mint ERC20s that represent the value of that, the ownership of that Gnosis safe, so that people can perform any kind of arbitrary actions. And some of the actions that you might do as a fractional owner of a certain NFT is voting together to, let's say, add an NFT to the collection, or listing it for sale. Or we have some custom contracts like Bounty Board, which takes in a certain NFT in return for a collection token. And then you can also craft kind of like arbitrary transactions using the SafeSnap module, which I think now they're calling Reality. So why Gnosis Safe? For us, our first use case is holding and managing assets, right? So we thought there's no other better platform for custodying assets than Gnosis. And we really identify with kind of the approach that they're taking with Zodiac in terms of making governance very modular. We are hopefully, and we're excited to kind of contribute to the ecosystem by perhaps making some modules of our own and helping the ecosystem grow in terms of managing NFT assets. And I'll dig into this soon in terms of, I think what we are going to see in terms of DAOs are just additional alternative like governance philosophies to come into practice. Plutocratic token voting is, I think, again, very primitive and doesn't really suit, I would say, all of the use cases of DAOs. So what others can we have? I think, one, an election process that is better defined. Like right now, there is no, any DAO that supports like delegation, for example, like ENS. It's very simple. You just have tokens, you delegate to a certain person, right? And what do? Then they can use those votes in terms of getting some actions passed in the ENS protocol. Having some sort of an election process, if we do want to mirror some sort of like a representative governance system like we have in many governments today, would allow for DAOs to be able to like function more effectively. I also don't necessarily think that DAOs need to be purely democratic. Like, DAOs are organizations. Like, you don't have every single person running Apple. Like, nothing would get done. They wouldn't have the best hardware like they do today. In the same way that I think DAOs can just simply have an autonomous way of putting leaders in place. And again, what's the 0 to 1 moment for Web3? You can have a peaceful coup d'etat, right? This whole peaceful transfer of power that people have tried to achieve with governments, now you can achieve, at least in the digital world, by providing, with code, individuals with, let's say, veto power or removal power of putting that decision maker out of the system. And then fourth is a reputation system of arbitrators. I pointed to this, what is this, chart graph, where we have this notion of a seasons DAO. So reality.eth is a type of mechanism where through a bonding mechanism, it determines whether a proposal is valid or not, right? But effectively, it ends up being kind of like a bidding process of who's willing to stake more and risk more in order to verify that this oracle is true, right? We currently provide this like arbitration ability or service where you would deploy a DAO on seasons or fractionalize on seasons because you get to avoid the, let's say, one of the attack vectors of just constant bombardment of proposals, right? Or a malicious proposal. But we think there is significant opportunity for us to improve on that model where you do have a system of arbitrators where it's not necessarily just us. I think there's still like there's significant value in different nodes being able to establish reputation for their services. And I think it is ideal to have not just us, but let's say other arbitrators come into our system and provide these services. And people can choose and have the flexibility of deciding which arbitrators to use. And then in terms of challenges and opportunities ahead, I think there's a lot to do in terms of like DAO participation. This is something that we're trying to tackle. So when NFTs are fractionalized, you are a fractional token holder. You now get things done by governance, right? And it's not, and governance takes so much effort, time, and mind share, you simply don't have the ability to go through every proposal. So from our perspective, how do you make that life cycle more manageable and easier? Does our current platform do that yet? I don't think so, but we will get there. DAO infrastructure, again, it comes back to why we choose Gnosis Safe. I think a lot of other platforms try to roll their own contracts and build a lighter version of a Gnosis Safe, if you will. I think rather than putting effort into kind of maintaining a set of contracts like that, I'd like to work with an ecosystem that has a lot of, I think the Gnosis team has put a lot of thought into the products that they've built, and it's part of growing together as an ecosystem in terms of, I don't know why I ended with regulatory, because nobody likes regulatory, but I think I think we're all seeing throughout the years, regulation becomes clearer, and DAOs will also start to be categorized into some sort of regulatory kind of environment, and I'm personally excited to see some more clarity there so that we can provide the best services for our users. And then, before questions, please come visit our booth, where you'll get we fractionalized a Pudgy Penguin, which I love, and we're giving about $20 worth of these tokens. So come visit our booth, and you'll be able to vote on some proposals based on the management of this Pudgy, and we'll add a few things in there. And follow me on Twitter, JL2FA. I'm trying to get 10K, but it's very far away. Thank you, and I'll take questions.
Thank you, John. Now we have about 5 minutes for questions.
Yes.
What's an example of a module that hasn't been built that you're interested in pursuing or developing?
We're playing around with this idea of a guardian. So how do you set some leaders in place that can have certain actions that they're able to do? So every Gnosis safe has some sort of a safe owner, right? And the safe owner can just do everything in the Gnosis safe. We remove the safe owner when we deploy our factory contract, but that owner can be set through governance, right? But I think what would be nice is if we have a module approach of having certain guardians that can have, let's say, the ability to list the NFT, and that's kind of a function that they have unilaterally without governance. I think that will be interesting to build.
Hey. Thanks very much for the talk. I'm fully behind the idea of using wallet abstractions for DAO tooling. This question might therefore be a little bit off topic, but I'd be interested in your opinion. So we had a speaker earlier on in the day talking about contributions to DAOs, and you've been speaking about governance. And those, I think, are two of the three important components for DAOs. The third, I think, is collaboration and kind of forming a collective mind meld on direction. And it's related to what you were talking about representative leaders and so on, but I feel like a lot of that is not kind of covered by tooling right now, at least Web3 tooling. Obviously, there's Discord, and so on. What can Web3 engineers and the Web3 community do to improve collaboration in DAOs?
I don't know. That's a tough question. We'll talk about it afterward. Yeah. I'll pass on that. Well, I mean, yeah, I don't know if I can provide any original kind of thought, but in terms of maybe just on the topic of collaboration, maybe. So we're still exploring what it means or what kind of actions that fractional token holders really want. And it's not entirely clear to us that certain owners just want collaboration all the time, right? One of the kind of use cases for fractionalization is just exposure to the NFT, right? So usually, if you think that this person who created the collection is a better NFT collector than I am, and therefore I will buy some of the collection tokens, you want the management of that to be largely curatorial, right? Not necessarily through collaboration. So I think it would be, maybe to answer your question directly, it would be based on the use cases that you see, right? So yeah, hopefully we can build it. Please show us some love, We just launched our public beta, so anyone can create a collection. And the first use case is NFT fractionalization, where you take some NFT and then create a collection token out of it. We also have this thing called DAO Season, where you can launch like a Gnosis safe that is governed through the collection token. It's like a no-code DAO deploy, right? And then we will be launching something called Pool Seasons, where you can pool money, pool ETH with your friends to buy a certain NFT. Yeah, thank you.
Cool. Thank you, John.